Hello everyone, Professor Krizlik here. So I wanted to make a second video, this time digging a little deeper into states and nations because it is such an important piece of comparative politics. So when students first encounter comparative politics, one of the most common sources of confusion is this difference between a state and a nation. In everyday language, like I said, sometimes I even use them interchangeably in class or when I'm talking to people. So in everyday language, people often use these terms quite interchangeably. We talk about nation states, national borders, national governments, as if they all mean the same thing. Because in conversation, sometimes that's just easier, or we get accustomed to it, or it's just what we're used to doing. In political science, when we're thinking about political science and talking about political science, there is a difference. States and nations do not mean the same thing, and having a little deeper understanding of the differences between them is kind of essential for understanding political conflict, identity, and governance around the world. So in this video, I wanted to make a second video. I wanted to just step back and slow down and clearly explain what the state is, what a nation is, how they differ, and why that difference matters to comparative politics. So let's begin with the state. A state, as we've read about, as we talked about in other videos, is a political and legal entity. It is an organization that exercises authority over a defined territory and population. Political scientists generally agree that a state has several key features: a government, a permanent population, a defined territory, sovereignty, and legitimacy. What makes a state distinctive is not just that it governs, but that it claims ultimate authority within its borders. The state makes laws, enforces them, we engage with the state, we interact with the state collects taxes, controls borders, claims the legitimate use of force. Whether a state is democratic or authoritarian, which we'll spend the next couple weeks thinking about, strong or weak, which we talked about in class, these core features define what it is, regardless if it's authoritarian or democratic, strong or weak. The state is this legal entity. One important thing to emphasize is that the state is not the same thing as a government. Governments change, leaders come and go, regimes rise and fall, but the state often persists across these changes. When a country holds an election, experiences a coup, or undergoes a revolution, the government may change, but the state usually remains. The state is therefore about authority and institutions, not about identity or culture. So if we can think of the state as this legal entity, let's turn for a minute to the idea of a nation, which is quite different, very different. A nation is a social and cultural concept rather than a legal concept. A nation refers to a group of people who see themselves as belonging together based on shared characteristics. These characteristics might include a common language, a common history, a common culture, a common religion, common traditions, or collective memories. Nations are really about identity, not authority. People belong to nations because they feel a sense of shared belonging, not because they are legally required to. You cannot easily point to a map and say, this is where a nation begins and this is where a nation ends, like you can with states, which have clear demarcated boundaries that are accepted by the international community. So if we can't say this is where a nation starts and this is where a nation ends, that's because nations exist primarily in people's minds and social relationships. So this distinction is quite crucial. States govern people and nations unite people in shared identities. Sometimes states and nations overlap neatly. When a single nation largely largely corresponds to a single state, we often describe this as a nation state. France is often used as a classic example in textbooks where the French state and the French national identity developed together over time. However, this neat overlap is actually the exception and not the rule. In our textbook, there's some diagrams and some images of how messy sometimes nations can be because they overlap states' borders. They don't rest neatly within a single state. Because many states are multinational, meaning they contain multiple national groups within one political authority. Canada, Spain, the United States, the United Kingdom, oftentimes examples of states that include more than one nation. In these cases, the state governs people who may not all share the same national identity. At the same time, many nations exist without their own state. These are known as stateless nations. Groups such as the Kurds are often cited as an example. They share a strong sense of national identity, but they're divided across multiple states rather than governing themselves in a single one. This mismatch between states and nations is one of the most important sources of political conflict in our contemporary world. When a nation does not have its own state, members of that nation may demand self-determination, the right to govern themselves. This can lead to independence movements, autonomy campaigns, or in some cases, violent conflicts as that group wants more independence. Conversely, when a state tries to impose a single national identity on a diverse population, it can generate resistance, exclusion, or even at times repression. Efforts to force cultural uniformity through language policy, education, or citizenship laws oftentimes provoke backlash from minority nations within the state. This helps explain why nationalism is such a powerful political force. Nationalism is the belief that a nation should have political self-rule, often through its own state. Nationalism can be inclusive, emphasizing shared civic values or maybe even shared civic participation. But it can also be exclusionary, defining the nation in ethnic, religious, or cultural terms that marginalize others, that exclude others. So understanding this difference, the difference between the state and nation, helps us see why nationalism can at times be written about in a liberating way or written about as a dangerous force of trouble. It has fueled independence movements and democratic struggles, but it has also been used to justify discrimination, territorial conflict, and even at times ethnic violence. Another key reason this distinction matters is because of legitimacy. A state is more stable when its authority aligns with national identity. When most people feel that the state represents their nation, when that alignment breaks down, states to, may struggle with legitimacy. Citizens may obey laws, but they may not feel loyal to the political system itself. This is why states invest so much effort and money and time and symbols and education into a national narrative. Flags, anthems, holidays, and official histories are all tools used by states to build or to reinforce national identity. In effect, states often try to create nations, or at least shape how national identity is understood. But this process is never complete or completely uncontested. In a globalized world like we're living through, the relationship between states and nations has become even more complex. Migration, multiculturalism, dual citizenship, and supranational institutions all complicate the idea that political authority and national identity should align or can even align neatly. Yet, despite these challenges, both states and nations remain central to politics. States still exercise legal authority and coercive power. Nations still shape how people understand who they are, who belongs, and what they owe to one another. So, the takeaway that we have to think about early on in our study of comparative politics is that a state is a political and a legal structure that governs territory and people. A nation is a social and cultural community based on shared identity. They often overlap, but they do not have to. And when they don't, politics becomes more complicated and at times can become more contentious. Understanding this distinction gives students a powerful tool for analyzing political systems, conflicts, and movements around the world. It helps explain why some states are stable while others face persistent challenges, and why questions of identity are so often at the heart of political struggles. That difference between authority and identity is why political scientists care so deeply, and it's covered so early in our chapter and in the semester about the distinction between a state and a nation. Thank you.